Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Weird shit in the boonies. I grew up in a heavily forested region of East Texas. All the locals in the area have at least one or two stories about the screwed up things they've experienced out there. I actually don't know a single person from out there who hasn't seen at least something once. Most of the residents have had regular, ongoing experiences with whatever these things, or thing, out in the woods. The descriptions aren't always the same. In fact, sometimes they're quite different. I figure I'd share a few of the stories that I personally experienced and some of the ones I collected. The area was also prone to flooding. It was near river bottoms and also a floodplain, so about once a year it would flood for about a week. The people who built their homes on top of the numerous hills would get trapped for a while. The people who built at the bottoms would have their homes about 10 to 15 feet underwater for about a week. The hilltop I was on had my home and a couple relatives' homes. My best friend at the time lived with one of my relatives. I think our total land was about 90 acres. Only a very tiny fraction was cleared. Most of it was still primal forest. The kids got left alone a lot. We didn't have a lot of money, so once kids were about 9 or 10, we were on our own a lot. No one worried about strangers much because it was very remote. Hell, it was a 20-minute drive to the nearest gas station. The land was very hilly, as I explained. Our backyard dipped down to a ravine formed by a little creek. This separated the cleared land from the forest. When I was little, my dad had cleared out little trails for me to bike through. At one point, they got us a golf cart so we could get to our neighbors' homes kind of quickly if something happened. It was also used just to haul stuff around. I kind of used it just for fun. One day, the entire hilltop was cleared. Everyone was at work or out at dinner or a movie. I had chosen to skip because my friend was coming home after spending 2 weeks at his dad's place. My aunt's house wasn't two-story, but she had a very sharp and high steep roof, so the attic had a pretty decent height to it in the center. Above the back door of the house was an old vent in the attic, but the slats had fallen off years before and were replaced by an old tarp. So I drive up into the relative safety of my aunt's backyard and see that the tarp has mostly fallen off. I kinda glanced up into the attic and saw someone up there. What I saw scared the shit out of me. It looked like a man, but it seemed like a thin layer of his skin was removed. His skin looked raw and kind of oozing, not really blood-covered, but like covered with pus and the water from a fever blister. His eyelids were gone. I can remember that very clearly. And he was just standing there, calmly looking at me. I was so scared I was paralyzed. Then he turned and walked out of view, deeper into the attic. I realized that the trap door leading into the house was that direction, and that sort of broke my paralysis. I snapped to and drove as fast as I could back to my own house. Not to be a stereotypical Texan, but we had a few guns in the house. I grabbed one and waited by the window facing the road for my friend to come home. So I finally see my friend's dad's car drive past. So I immediately pick up the phone and keep calling him over and over again. I know the attic door is close to the front door, and the back door has a wall that is a barrier between them. So as soon as he picks up, I start yelling at him to run out the back door and come over immediately. I heard a loud banging noise over the phone, and then my friend screamed. A few seconds later, I saw him running up the path to my house. He told me he heard the attic door open, then the latch for the ladder got knocked down. We used to camp out in the woods behind my house. Today, after thinking back to the fucked up things we saw, I kind of wonder why we did that. But I guess it's all we knew. Probably the same thing that keeps people who live in dangerous neighborhoods walking around the worst parts alone. One of my schoolmates and I were out camping. He was also from the area and was used to seeing the weird shit. The shadow people that everyone talks about were the most common. We would see them in the trees sometimes, sitting up on high branches, watching us. For some reason, we always thought we were safe if we were inside this little spot we had built. We weren't. We found out. But that idea sort of became a game rule in our heads. So after a while, the fire started dying down. And that was when we started hearing them all around us. Keep in mind that we grew up in the sticks. You learn to recognize the sound of squirrels, raccoons, deer, bears, etc. Humans make rather easily identifiable sounds with their movements. And these things did seem to move like humans, and we could see them sometimes. And it seemed like there were dozens of them, more than any of us had ever seen before. He and I got spooked, and just decided to run all the way back through the woods to the house. It was very dark. The woods were so thick it tended to blot out a lot of the moon and starlight outside of a few natural clearings, like our camping spot. So my friend and I are running, mostly blind, through the woods. It gets really thick the closer you get to that ravine. Lots of scrub and bushes and vines. What was worse is we could hear a lot of somethings running behind us too. I felt something hit my back and I fell. I heard my friend yell too. We slid down the mud and got cut up kind of bad by all the growth out there. Ran through the creek and up the hill to my place. Our clothes were muddy and torn up pretty bad. Both of our backs were cut up pretty bad. Looked like claw marks. We went back in the afternoon to get the radio. This next story is partially mine and partially the rest of my family's. We would hear stuff in the house, a lot. Most often the sounds of kids laughing. This wasn't really a neighborhood. There were no neighbor kids around or anything. I heard the entire time I lived there, from birth until I was 17. I'd hear other things too. The sounds of people talking in other rooms. A lot of that I can easily write off as just imagination or stress. But sometimes it was so very clear. Then one day my mother had her sisters over, and I heard them talking about the same thing. That apparently my mom, my aunt, the one who lived there, the rest of my aunts, who visited from time to time, and even my dad would hear this. But no one talked about it to each other until one day my grandmother mentioned the sound of laughing kids was driving her crazy. She died when I was only a year old. I overheard this story when I was 13 or so. And no, I haven't heard voices since I moved from that place. There's a place not terribly far from where I grew up that's famous for ghost lights. People come from all over to drive down Bragg Road and see the lights. The town is called Saratoga. No, I didn't grow up there. It was a decent drive away, but close enough so it wasn't a massive chore to get there. We went there every so often as a kid. When I was a teenager, we used to pile into someone's car or truck and drive out there too, looking for the lights. Sometimes you'd see them, sometimes not. The lights typically look like glowing spheres, some white, some yellow, some blue or green. They range in size from about basketball size to about 4 or 5 times larger than that. The DO seem to respond to you if you yell at them. Around 2001 or so, I was in town, visiting a friend. We decided, for old time's sake, to drive out there. We left early in the day, so we could explore a bit before it got dark. See what else we could find before hitting Bragg Road a few times. We were hoping we'd get lucky and see the lights, so he and I left early. Decided to get there early in the day to have enough time to drive around, scope out the rest of the town and anything else that might be interesting. We figured we'd hit Bragg Road a few times once it got dark and hopefully see the lights. Saratoga is small, really friggin' small, and kinda creepy. There really wasn't much to look at in town. Seriously, a feed store and a general store. In 2001. It's like going back to 1930. So we started looking around some of the other back roads besides Bragg Road. Eventually we found one that led into the Big Thicket National Preserve and started exploring the weird mix of primeval forest with the occasional cleared spots with oil pumps in them. One road led much deeper into the woods where we found an old cemetery. I think it was called the Teal Cemetery. Just a small circle of cleared and manicured lawn, surrounded by a chain-link fence with a road leading away on one side and thick woods on all the rest of the sides. When we got out of the car, the sound of the mosquitoes humming was louder than you'd think possible. They were thicker than you'd think possible. Both he and I got a real sick feeling in our stomachs as soon as we got out of my car. We decided that we'd camp there that night if we got a chance. The place just felt really bad. Note, We didn't wind up camping there. You'll find out why in a moment. So he and I started exploring the cemetery. It was neatly manicured and trimmed, and must be regularly kept up. We found what looked like a couple exhumed graves. No bodies or anythings. Just a few partially flooded holes in the ground that were grave-shaped. I found what looked like a stunted tree, and a few bushes that were growing in a sort of bubble, covering something. I went into the little spot under then, and saw one of the little flat grave markers. I moved the grass aside to see the name and date, and hear a very loud buzzing sound come from under it. A noise kind of like a joy buzzer or a spinning toy car engine. I know that doesn't sound too dramatic, but we were really keyed up and it scared the shit out of me. I jumped out of that little grove, and he and I continued to explore the cemetery. Then we noticed a little footpath leading into the woods, opposite direction of the road leading away. Again, my friend grew up in the same area, so he had enough experiences of his own. We decided to check out the path. The path led maybe a quarter mile into the woods before we found something a little strange. There was a perfect circle of dry, cracked dirt in the middle of the woods. This is very wet and lush forest. It rains a ton here, and everything is very vibrant and green. As creepy as this place is, it's also very gorgeous. This circle was stone dry. All the leaves that had fallen were rotted and dead. Limbs of trees that were reaching over the circle died the moment they broke. Its borders, just clean and living until they breached the circle, then just rotting away to crumbly shit after that. We walked into the circle and started talking about what we thought it was. I got the idea that there was something buried there, so I got a heavy log to try to break up enough of that crust so I could maybe try to dig into it. I had just started breaking into the soil when he and I heard a very loud scream come from the woods. It was very loud. It sounded very angry and very big. The roar was deep too. We heard this thing roar again, and then heard loud crashing and footsteps rushing towards us and started seeing the trees shaking. We ran as fast as we could, hopped the fence into the cemetery, and ran to the gate to my car, and drove away as fast as we could. My friend and I drove to the general store and grabbed some snacks and drinks and calmed down. We both decided that our original idea of camping out there was dumb, but we wanted to look at it again. It started to get dark, so we made our first pass down Bragg Road and didn't see the lights. So we turned around and made our way back down the road and saw a few of them off in the woods. After 2 more passes and a few more sightings, we headed back to the Teal Cemetery. We walked around the cemetery, briefly flirted with the idea of going back down that footpath, but decided against it. The lights were everywhere, though. That feeling of nervousness just kept growing, so we pretty quickly just decided to go back home. There's one that I heard from my parents and later confirmed from someone else in the community that was involved. This place is kind of fucked up. It's a 20-minute drive to the nearest gas station, but you can't throw a rock without hitting a Baptist or Pentecostal church. Lots of Pentecostals out there. So this happened before I was born, probably about 3 or 4 years before I was born. It was during one of those floods. Our house was always okay during the floods, as was my grandfather's place and my aunt's place. But usually after 2 or 3 days, we'd lose power. We had a generator, thankfully, and would have to use a boat to get to higher ground if we needed to leave. So about 2 days into the flood, one of the neighbors, air quotes on that, still about 10 minutes away, boated over and barged into the house. This woman was a deeply devout backwoods Christian. No drinking, no dancing, no drugs, no swearing. You know the type. She immediately started demanding my dad's booze. Dad drank, but not much. He gave her some beer, but she didn't want that, so she grabbed the isopropyl from the bathroom and drank some, then left. Her neighbor found her a few days later. She was ripped apart. He said it looked like someone had pulled her apart and animals had ripped her up and eaten parts of her. He also said there was weird shit on the walls. This neighbor of hers was mildly regarded, I think. He died about a year or so after he told me this story, smoking while cleaning an engine in gasoline. Burned his house down and almost killed his nieces when the fire caught his ammunition on fire. Here's a story from one of my neighbors. They lived kinda on the same hill, but about halfway down it. I'd take this story with a heaping tablespoon of salt because they were both severe alcoholics and friends to just about any drug that would float their way. They told us that they drove out to Saratoga once and saw the lights. They said the lights chased them down the road for a while. I have seen that kind of behavior from the lights before, but eventually they lost them. They parked the car at the end of Bragg Road to have a couple beers, and the guy walked off to take a piss and came back with cuts and gashes all over him. He said the lights touched him, and it caused the cuts to appear all over him. But as I said, those people were drunks. When it would rain, but not quite flood that creek behind our house, would connect with the major river about 10 miles away. We would sometimes boat down the river and tie off so we could camp elsewhere. People have settled out there for a couple centuries now. But the land changes so much because of the flooding that the locations of the settlements change. I think now, with dams and such, it's kind of in a pretty permanent configuration. But you'll find old houses and shit like that out in the woods. So me, the same guy from the story about the camping trip in the woods behind the house, and another mutual friend of ours, we'll call the first guy P and the second guy R, started exploring the woods near the banks of the main river. This river is huge, and this location is also quite remote. You need a boat to even get out there. We came across one of these old houses, fairly near the banks. It was obvious why it was abandoned long ago. It had started to collapse when the course of the river cut into the land a bit. There was a 20-foot drop close by, and it had shifted the base of the house. The house wasn't falling down, but it was leaning a lot. 2 stories. We had some sterno, my old boombox, food and bedrolls, shit like that. Decided that since it was raining, we'd camp out in the house. We ate, listened to some music, drank the little bit of booze that we had filched, not much, and just talked about normal shit that people talk about that age. Eventually, we all crashed out in the living room. We all wanted to use the fireplace, but decided it was a bad idea. I'm guessing we were only asleep for about an hour or two when we woke up. Something was screaming upstairs. It sounded like someone screaming in pain and fear. We all snapped awake, yelling at ourselves. Then we heard someone else yelling, screaming and swearing upstairs. There were banging noises, and the first voice stopped screaming. And then we heard something opening one of the surviving doors upstairs and coming our way. We grabbed our shit and started running to the banks where our boat was. As I handed down our stuff to P, I saw someone standing in the front door. He had something in his hands. I know it's a cliché, but it looked like an axe. That was the last time we camped in that particular area. Though about a year later, we did camp across the river on the sandbanks. Nothing happened that time except us drinking way too much tequila. I remember there was a red house at the bottom of the hilltop I lived on. During the floods, this house would have water at least 10 feet above its roof. It was a total shithole. But every few years, some family would move in for a while. None stayed very long. There was a pond next to the house, and behind it was the same creek that ran behind mine. I remember the driveway was paved with white shells. Little white shells and chalk. A lot of people would see shit around this house. Usually a very tall man, gray-skinned, heavily wrinkled, wearing a long black coat and a hat and glowing green eyes. I had caught glimpses of this thing a few times, usually close to the red house. One day I got off the bus at the end of the road. There was an old couple that lived at the end of the road that were almost like a third pair of grandparents to me. I stopped by to say hello and walked the rest of the way home. I had nothing else to do, so I started wandering around the yard, looking for something interesting, maybe left behind from the last family that had left the house. The previous family had a couple kids my age that I had been friends with. I kinda missed them. I opened the front door and started looking around the house. The floor was bare concrete, and the house smelled of dust and mold, and that unique smell that only flooded homes get. Kinda hard to explain, but if you've ever gotten a lot of water in your home, you know it. I wandered into my friend's room, feeling really bad for the guy. My family didn't have a lot of money or anything, but it made me feel like shit that this kid had to live in this kind of hellhole. I heard the back door slam shut, and decided that instead of just assuming it was the wind, I'd do the smart thing and just go out the other door very quickly. I left the bedroom and moved to the other end of the house and tried to open the door. I couldn't get it open. And no, it wasn't the horror movie thing where a door that should open won't open. This was a wood house that had flooded a lot. The door was just really stuck. I could hear something opening and closing all the doors in the house behind me, and footsteps getting closer. It really felt like whatever it was really wanted to scare me as much as possible. I finally managed to yank the door open and get outside. I glanced back and saw it. Just as I described. Tall. Its skin was grayish, and not really decayed, just very old-looking, heavily wrinkled. More so than you'd think a human could have sustained through just aging. Its eyes had a bright green glow. I slammed the door and moved quickly away from the house, but tried to keep it in view through the windows. We continued to stare at each other as I walked backwards, until I couldn't keep it in sight any longer. Then I ran the rest of the way to my house. I was very happy to see that my mom was already home. People in that neighborhood all reported variations of that same thing. Its exact height would change, and not many people got close enough to report on its wrinkled face or gray skin. But everyone talked about the height, the long coat, the hat, and the glowing green eyes. I was home alone. At this time period, I would usually be home alone about 2 hours after school before my mom would get off work. So I got home and grabbed some food. I got to my room and was playing Doom. I heard someone calling me from the den. Kinda downstairs, just a few steps with a very narrow door in the living room. I yelled back and then just heard someone talking. Just a kind of murmur, muffled by the walls. I got up and walked to the den and heard my mom pull up, so I got my baseball bat and opened the door. There was something in the fireplace. I remember having really big eyes and teeth, and then I couldn't see it anymore. Not exactly like it vanished while I was staring at it, more like it just moved out of my eye line. I don't know why, but the fact that this happened in bright daylight in my home scared me more than the being's appearance. This is one reported to me by the same friend of mine that went to Saratoga with me in the story about the cemetery. When I first met him, he was renting a house my dad owned about 2 miles down the road. That house was very small and had been used as a workshop by my dad for his old business. It was also the oldest house in that area, and while my family just referred to it as the Little House, the rest of the community called it either the Haunted House or the Murder House. Apparently, the original owners of the house were found dead and stuffed under the porch. My friend M said he fell asleep in the living dining room watching TV one day. He woke up and saw a light rise up from the floor, pause a few moments, then move through the house towards the back door. That had since been made into a second room, and vanished. He said that there was blood on the floor where it had come through, and little drops of it in the path the light had taken through the house. The little house M lived in had been in my family since I was a kid. My dad used it as a workshop and headquarters for his business for a while. When my brother graduated from school, he lived in the house for a short while. When I was very young, I would sometimes go there while Dad was working and wander around or play. I remember Dad had this dummy scarecrow thing. It was tall, grayish-black, and very faded. There had been a sketchy face drawn on it, but I guess a few decades in the sun had faded it. The legs and arms ended in stumps, but Dad would put coveralls on it and rubber boots and work gloves to complete the illusion. About all you could see was the sketch of a face sort of smiling at you from a distance. There was a hook coming out of the top of its head, so it could be suspended from a tree. He named it Vincent. I remember bringing my Nintendo over to the little house and playing it and getting creeped out, because Vincent was facing me from the front yard. I closed the curtains and went back to playing it. I could hear Dad in the front yard, walking back and forth, so I just kept playing Wizards and Warriors. After a while, I heard Dad start up the machines in the back, and while it was running, I heard more footsteps outside the front window. Thinking that my brother had come over, I opened the blinds and Vincent was on a different tree, right in front of the house, looking in the window at me. I was really scared and then mad because I knew Dad had moved him. So I pretty much put it out of my mind, and soon enough my brother showed up. He played a bit of Nintendo with me, and then Dad asked him to run into town with him. They asked me if I wanted to go, but I wanted to keep playing Wizards and Warriors, so I passed. I asked if they'd bring me back some of the frozen pudding pops, and my brother said he would. They left, and I went back to my game. Every now and then I'd peek at the window and see if they were back yet, and after a few times I realized that Vincent was gone. I found him later. He was at the side of the house. This happened a few times. I'd hear something moving and find Vincent had moved from one location to another. I never saw him clearly move, though one time I thought I saw a shape of about the same size and color moving. Eventually he just vanished. Dad and my brother looked for him and just figured someone saw him and thought it was cool and stole it. There were some interesting things that happened after we moved. We sold the house when I was 17. My grandfather died long before that, and his house was taken over by a redneck. My aunt sold her place a couple years before we did, and that guy was actually kind of cool. Since we all moved, the people in my aunt's house died. The redneck kind of went batshit, beat up his wife, and I last heard rumors that he had off himself. The first family that bought my place went from being really nice people to kind of nut jobs. The wife left. The husband started dating an underage neighbor about a year after his wife left, then went to cooking meth in our barn. He eventually moved away and went to prison. The last family that bought it seemed to be doing well, but the house itself was destroyed during Hurricane Ike. I think I'm going to take a trip out there with some friends in a couple weeks, and then head on to Saratoga to recheck out the Teal Cemetery and Bragg Road. After I moved, I came back with M and the girl I was seeing at the time. This would have been around 1999 or so. My ex, L, wanted to see the place. She had heard M and I talking about it. So we drove past my old house and parked near the bottom of the hill next to one of the bridges. There was an old shack out in the woods, so we walked her out there. It was basically just a tin roof with a table, a sink, dirt floor, and an old pump well. She thought it was cool, so we sat out there and smoked and chatted. Em and I both noticed it before she did. We heard the insects stop and started hearing the footsteps. The same shadowy things P and I had encountered in the woods. Those did seem to be the most common things seen. Em and I led her back out to the road. We could hear them following, but they never made any move towards charging us or anything. Just slowly followed. We made it out to the road. I remember it was very bright for nighttime. Maybe not a full moon, but a very clear night and a bright moon. And being that far from any city lights, you'd be amazed at how much illumination that can offer out in the country. We walked down to the second bridge and Elle started to relax. She was amazed that we lived with that for so long. We just kind of shrugged and explained that every place has its shit you deal with. After a while, we saw someone standing on the road ahead of us. We all got the same creeped out feeling about it, so we started moving back to our car. The figure started running at us. I heard Elle scream as we passed the bridge next to the car, got the door open for her, and she leaned across the seats to unlock the other side for Em and me. I got in the car and heard her scream again and watched her get pulled from the car. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back, and she slammed the door and locked it, and we drove off. After we were a safe distance down the road, heading towards my apartment, she told me she had seen something that looked like a very large human skull, with thick, wild-looking hair looking over the bridge at us, and that something had grabbed her ankle and tried to pull her from the car. She never went back out there with us again.
I am also really enjoying this. If I wanted, I could post a few stories as well. They're not as long as OP's, and they don't take place in Texas, but I have a handful of stories too, if anyone wants. Here's one. It's pretty similar to OP's Vincent the Scarecrow story. I was in the 3rd grade, up in the Sierras of California. We were in a small town about 50 miles north-northwest of Lake Tahoe. We were staying with a retired man who made his money on the side farming. Both my parents worked 9 to 12-hour shifts. They never had stable shifts. The man was out working on the farm, and my parents were working, and did not come home for a good 3 or 4 hours. I had heard a lot of stuff in this house, and tended to only see things in one specific room, where the man's mother had passed away. One day I was playing on the piano for an old lady who liked to listen to me play. She didn't technically live there, just resided. My fingers started hurting, and the man called me outside to help him out with something, so I closed up the piano, and the old lady told me to stop and to stay and keep playing. I said no, and she got this really twisted, malevolent look on her face. She started shouting at me, "Keep playing, you little shit!" And it freaked me out because I was only about 7 or 8. I ran away, and I heard this scream behind me, and then the whole house shook. I fell over and hit my head on the table as I was running and got knocked out. I woke up on the couch later to find the man sitting there beside me, and he looked really distressed for some reason. He realized I had woken up, and without turning his head said, "So, I see you met Elizabeth." We were the only living people in the house, so I knew he was talking to me, even though it didn't seem like it. I just said, "What?" He told me about how he had a visitor who had a short temper and tended to get really pissy when she didn't get her way. That didn't explain why the earth shook. We later found out that it was just an earthquake, my first one. The only unusual thing is that when he ran into the house to find me and saw that every single door, drawer, and cupboard was open, he never bothered to close them. He just went back to work with his chickens. I went back to the piano, played for a bit, and when I closed the cover, I heard this great big slam and found out everything was closed when I closed the cover.
I live in Ohio, and in a semi-rural area. It's a small town, and there's a lot of people who see they've seen stuff or had it happen to them. I work with a lady who lives in an even smaller town who has a bunch of stories, too, mostly about her house. Strange shit has happened in each house I've lived in, and I'm convinced that it's this area. I lived with my mother in a house in an allotment surrounded by woods, and the house we moved into was apparently owned by some strange people before. Not occultist-like, but they kept mean dogs and let them run the neighborhood, shit like that. Either way, nobody else in the neighborhood liked that house, saying it was weird and creepy. Anyways, we move in and don't have enough rooms for everybody, so my mother and stepfather decide to give me my own room, since I'm the oldest, in the basement. Now I should say that ever since I moved there, I never liked it. It was miserable, damp, and humid all of the time, even in the winter, and just had this very unwelcome air to it. My stepmother wouldn't even walk inside of it when she came to pick us up, saying that she got a very negative feeling from the house. The first few months or so of having my own room were pretty cool, but then weird shit started happening. I would see things in the corner of the basement opposite my room. It started out with just movements out of the corner of my eyes, but as I got braver, I would actively search for whatever it was. One night I turned off all the lights in the basement except for one, and I saw a figure standing right in the corner. It was vaguely humanoid, but mostly just black and really, really tall, almost hitting its head on the basement ceiling. It started coming towards me, and I slammed my door and locked it. I could see it blocking spots of light from coming under my door, though, and I knew it was standing out there. I turned on my light in my room and stayed up all damn night. I was never brave enough to look around again, though. But up until the day I moved out of that house, I still saw things standing in front of my door at night, sometimes big and sometimes small, but always there. Another story about the same room, but not as long. I used to have a nightlight for a while after that stuff started happening. One time I saw stuff dripping from the drop ceiling, which I'll admit I first thought was blood, but rationalized it out to be water dripping from a pipe in the ceiling. However, when I went to turn on the light, I checked both where it had been dripping from and the carpet beneath, and nothing was there at all. I also had a very terrifying encounter with something looming over my bed at night. I was listening to my iPod one night, not particularly sleepy or anything, but I closed my eyes and was listening to music when I just got this feeling that I was being watched. I opened my eyes, and there was just this disembodied floating head, which looked like a raccoon, but with a headdress or something on it, just screaming in my face. I ran out of that room so fucking fast I tripped up the stairs. By the time I got upstairs, I was bawling. My mom asked me what happened, and I told her, but all she really gathered was that there was a raccoon in the basement, but we never found anything there. Needless to say, though, I don't live there anymore. One more story about that house, then I'll move on to some others. This one isn't as creepy, though, at least to me. I used to have a room up on the normal level which I shared with my sister. I had a pet rat named Holly, and she had a glass cage with a metal portion on top that added 3 more levels to her cage. She would grind and chew on the metal bars all night, but eventually she passed away. I could still hear that sound though, but never mentioned it to anybody as I thought it was just my imagination. But it turns out that my brother, who had that room after I moved out, kept hearing it too. He said it never really scared him though, but it was too loud to be anything in the walls. My cousin lives on the edge of a lake in a very old house, built back in the late 1800s or early 1900s. Either way, it's so bad that when it storms, the entire house will move. I used to spend the night at her house all the time, but it was creepy as shit. You could hear kids laughing and things would move around all the time, sometimes going missing for days at a time before showing up again. I remember seeing weird shadow-like people by the lake on some of the farther paths. They'd just stand there and somehow you knew they were looking at you. We never got close to them before we'd start running back towards the house. She's reported seeing and talking to a young girl in her house, who she says is the person who moves all the stuff. She's only seen her once or twice though. But she said that her mother has seen her too. Her mom herself won't admit to it, but what she will admit to is that when my cousin was little, she bought her a toy to play with that hung on the edge of her crib. She said that a cat came into the room, which she thought was a stray one of her sons brought home, and just started staring at my cousin, and the toy started making noise on its own, like the batteries were dying, but people were screaming from inside it. The house I live in now is my dad's, and it's relatively in the city, but weird shit still happens here. My brother and sister who moved here with me say they've seen people in the house who will disappear, and all of us have been terrified of the hallway outside of our bedroom since we were little. It feels like there's something evil there. There's no other way to describe it, like you're being watched constantly. You can also hear voices and music coming from downstairs if you're upstairs, but when you step out into the hallway at the top of the steps to hear better, they all stop suddenly. I don't know what it is, but it's creepy as shit. My stepmother said, before she moved out, that her uncle who used to live in the house with her was crippled and very bitter about the whole thing. And she said he invited many negative things into the house that she doesn't think has left completely. None of these really have endings though, since they're all just random shit that's happened. My grandmother's house was scary too. I'll call her Granny H since if I have enough time I might post about my other one later. But most of the shit that happened there nobody seems to remember, or at least to want to admit. I remember being at her house and walking up the hill towards her silo with my aunt. Her farm had been out of use for years now, and the silo was empty, no machinery running or anything of the sort. It was an overcast day, but you could still see light behind the clouds. Anyways, as we got up to the silo, I remember distinctly hearing a resonating humming noise coming from the sky. Not anything man-made, mind you, but more like the kind you'd associate with UFOs. I can't remember anything past that, but I know for a fact it wasn't a dream or anything because it doesn't feel like one, and I remember it very clearly, but it has a different feeling to it than the rest of my memories. Like it's too hazy and oversaturated. This happened around the time when I was 5 or 6 maybe, and it's one of the things that I can still remember to this day, so it's always stuck out to me. But each time I ask my aunt about it, she says she doesn't remember it at all. My mother had a similar story about the field just behind the silo. Apparently she, her father, and a few friends were all riding their snowmobiles when lights began following them in the sky directly overhead. She said they were like spotlights, and no matter where she turned, they would follow them. They got creeped out and rode back to the house, and she said that the lights stopped by the time they got up to the porch, but they never found out what they were. More about my current house. This just happened a few weeks ago. I collected figurines and had them all sitting up on my shelf above my bed. I was listening to music on my laptop, which is all the way across the room, when something hits me on the head. Thinking it's a bug or something, I swipe my hair down, yank my headphones off and turn around, only to see the broom from one of my figures laying on the floor. The figure itself wasn't moved from her position in the slightest, and there's no way that it could just project itself all the way across the room towards my head. You can also hear ticking clocks at night sometimes, Sometimes one, or sometimes multiples, even though we don't own any analog clocks in our house. There's this one lady at my work that claims that her house is over a portal or whatever they're called and is apparently a hotbed for ghosts and such, both good and bad. Her house is built over the entrance to an old mine shaft, and both she and the previous owners have all seen miners in the basement. She said they don't do anything, and they don't scare her, but it's still pretty creepy. Her daughter told me that she once saw a cat run out from under the couch, across the living room, across the kitchen, up on the counter, and out the window before, to which my coworker, who was in the kitchen at the time, said was true, and that the cat was see-through, like it was made of heat waves or something. She's also felt the cat crawl up on her bed at night, which she doesn't mind. At my other grandmother's house, I'll call her Granny J, she also had a lot of land like my other one. We would ride four-wheelers out on her fields and through her woods, but once night came, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody still playing out there in the dark. There were 20-plus grandchildren there, and all of us, even the adults, wouldn't go into the woods at night. Everybody has claimed that they're seen weird animals or heard weird noises at night. I still have nightmares of running from things in her woods, even though it's been a good 8 or so years since I've actually been there. Now, this one is more of a story that is just floating around our city in general. But my cousin, a different one, lives directly opposite the site of an abandoned orphanage. The story is, according to my cousin, that the owner of the orphanage used to torture the kids that lived there, but one night, they hung him in the basement. Apparently, you could still see lights and everything in the windows long after it had been empty, and my friend's mother, who used to live by it, claims that it is, for a fact, true. She said you could also hear kids laughing and crying, and that sometimes you could even see the owner in it. However, it's long since been burned down, so nobody can really explore it anymore. But my cousin said that he's been over there, and it definitely is creepy. And on top of that there's tunnels underneath of it that he's been in. There's an old castle in the city, and there are rumors of tunnels all over that are supposed to be escape tunnels for the residents that live there, but nobody has really found any so far. That last bit is kind of unrelated, but still pretty interesting at the very least.
Might as well add a story of my own to the mix. Probably not so much scary as weird. Before I moved off to college, I lived in Washington State. The area I lived in was very rural, and although no part of my yard actually bordered any woods, I could see them from my house. I didn't really play in the woods much as a kid because I didn't have many friends to play with, and I would have had to walk through other people's yards to get to the woods, and also we had mountain lions. My yard was interesting enough for me, and there was no risk of getting eaten. My story takes place when I was probably about 10-ish. I'm not honestly sure. It was a bit foggy, cliché I know but true, which in and of itself was odd for Washington. I was inside my house, on the second story, and for some reason I started looking out the living room window. I think I was just admiring the way the trees faded out of existence in the distance. Anyway, as I was watching, my neighbor went down his driveway to collect his mail. This is where things got weird. As he came back up his driveway, a strange ball of fog formed behind him. He was close enough for me to be able to definitively say that this wasn't just some trick of the fog or the light. Anyway, the fog ball had the same texture as normal fog, except it was much denser. It couldn't have been much more than a foot in diameter, but I couldn't see through it at all. The edges were also oddly indistinct. It sort of gained density or opacity or whatever the shit the closer you got to the middle, until it was just a white fuzz against the dark of the neighbor's car, which was serving as a backdrop. Whatever it was, it lasted long enough to follow him for probably 5 or 6 paces, then just melted away. I never saw anything similar to it again, but the experience has always stuck out to me just because of its eccentricity. Oddly enough, I wasn't really scared, probably because it wasn't following me, but I also didn't really want to do anything, or even move for fear that I'd, screw things up somehow. In retrospect, that feeling makes no sense, but it stuck with me, so I figure it's worth a mention.
Might as well bump this with a story of my own, although this derives from the English countryside. I used to live in this reconstructed house that was half destroyed during the war. A bomb had hit it directly, and half the house had been blown away. Apparently, a man died from the explosion whilst he was in the bathroom. I don't know how credible this is, but it's nothing completely out of the ordinary. Anyway, the house had a lot of weird stuff to do with it. I remember my dad pried open a loose floorboard after he heard clinking of glass coming form beneath the house. There were hundreds of really old, empty bottles, wine, beer, whiskey, etc. There were also bits of paper all about the place with really violent handwriting. You know, that famous letter from Jack the Ripper that was supposedly said to be legit because of the aggressive handwriting a serial killer would possess. Well, it reminded me of that, like Jack the Ripper's letter. There were also a few faded photographs of German soldiers from the war, which is peculiar in itself within an old English home. On the back of these photographs were various pencil drawings of strange symbols I still do not recognize to this day. Well, that corner of the living room where all this weird shit was discovered was strange in itself. We had 3 cats, and every so often when they were in the same room, they would completely stop whatever they were doing and stare at the corner intently. After it happened a few times, I tried to carry one out of the room, but it always ran back inside with a fluffy tail and just sit. They normally stared for a good 20 minutes before they went back to licking their asses. We used to have a piano in that corner, and sometimes, normally at night, it would start playing. Nothing musical, just like someone was thwacking their hand against the keys nonsensically. We had a lid to the keys, so it couldn't have been the cats. We got rid of the piano eventually because of its age and how it creeped us all out. Also, minor things would happen. The light in my living room was controlled by a switch in which you push and twist to turn on. Every so often, it would turn on and fade upwards. When I went to check on the switch, it had been moved, when clearly no one was near it. One defining memory of the house was when I was about 11. I remember waking up at around 1 a.m. really, really thirsty. I hated going downstairs at night, but my mouth was dry, so I needed to. I hate typing this out because reliving the moment is terrifying. I remember standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at a figure in my hall. It was too dark to distinguish any real details, but I noticed an arm was missing. He stared at me with a cocked head. Now I was paralyzed with fear. I've never felt such fear in my life. If the myth was true, about 5 white streaks would have ran through my hair. I admit I pissed myself as well, and my knees felt so weak I almost fell down the stairs. I tried to move, but I couldn't. He stretched an arm out in my direction and just held it there. Suddenly, I felt an agonizing pain in my stomach. That snapped me out of paralysis, and I bolted for my parents' bedroom. I dragged them out, and when they came to inspect my claim, it turned and walked into my kitchen. They saw it, though, and my dad called the police. They never found anything.
I used to live in a haunted house and can tell stories from that if it's wanted. I don't have too many abnormal things that happen to me that relate to OP's experiences, though. No outdoor urban legend type things except one. I grew up in Southern California, and out there is this famously haunted canyon called Black Star Canyon. For a while, me and my friends were really into ghost hunting. I think my haunted house gave us the idea. So we went to this canyon trying to find something. We run into another group of people looking for shit. We decide to join forces because supposedly there are Satanists who kill animals and people traveling alone in this area, never confirmed. We walk around this huge bend and see a structure up a hill between us. We have 2 flashlights. We decided to go up the hill towards the structure. We get about halfway there, and then one of the flashlights goes out. We figure whatever is probably just dead batteries. We finally get to the structure, and we split into small groups to examine it. It's 2 main rooms, and one of the rooms is split in 2. A kitchen-type area and a dining room. The other seems to be a bedroom. I'm in a group with my friend Justin, and we are joking about the lack of shit happening and all the stupid graffiti on the walls. We suddenly hear rustling in front of us, then on the sides, then towards where we came up, and then we hear a scream. The 2 people we met there were bolting it down the hill, and the girl was crying. My friends and I decide it's a good idea for us to run off as well. I looked behind me to see what it was. All I saw was all the bushes in the area, seriously about 100 of them shaking violently. I think to myself it's probably animals of some kind. Nope.jpg. One crosses the threshold of the hill's line of sight and into the moonlight. The only way I can describe it is a creature about 3.5 feet tall walking on hind legs that looked very human, but could not discern a single feature of it. Just black, no light drops, no shadows, just negative space. I only saw this thing for a second before I had to look in front of me, and then the other flashlight went out. We were now running for our lives in complete darkness, being chased by unseen entities. We finally reached the end, and the girl who we met there described to us exactly what I saw. The rest don't believe her until I collaborate the story. She said it talked to her for a second, and she thought it was one of us until she turned around and saw it. That's when she screamed and started running. One thing I do remember about this was it did not move like a human. I'm a cartoonist. I know how people move, and this did not move like one of us. To end the story, we all ended up going to Denny's, eating pancakes and talking about this shit for like 2 hours.
I suppose a good place to start would be at that house. We moved there when I was about 4 after my parents divorced. It had a pretty huge yard, the back and right side of it overgrown with trees. Behind us lived this old couple who almost never left their homes, and to the left of us was this thicket of woods we called the Trails. That's the place where I saw a good part of the unsettling things I remember, but I'll get to that in a moment. My mom was a nurse aide and worked graveyard shifts a lot, so my little brother and I left home most of the day. Oftentimes I'd find myself staying up really late. Something about my room made me really uncomfortable, like it felt heavy in there. There'd be many nights I'd barely sleep at all because I heard things, saw things, and then I started sleepwalking. I'd have really strange dreams about floating from my body, over my bed, out the door. I would always see horrible things outside, and sometimes they'd grab at my ankles or drag me into the trees. I woke up some nights on the kitchen floor or slumped against the door. A few times I actually woke up outside in a heap. It was incredibly terrifying, especially for a kid my age, 7 or 9 at the time. In the mornings, I tried not to think about them. My room felt okay during the day and I played outside a lot. Most of the time, I'd head off to the trails on my bike. It was my neighbor's land, but he'd let us play there. I'd usually do it alone, but sometimes a friend would tag along. One day I was biking through there after a rain and everything was misty. It had that wet, dead leaf smell, thick in the air, and I was stomping through puddles, not particularly going anywhere, and turning the corner at the end of a trail, I froze. About 10 feet from me, in a puddle of grimy black water, lay something fat, slimy and pulsating. Its skin was a pus-soaked yellow, veiny, and its head looked too heavy for its body. It looked vaguely human. I was terrified, but through my terror I wanted to investigate further, so naturally I grabbed a stick and started towards it. And then it made a noise, a long, drawn-out ch-ch-ch, and it sounded so phlegmy and pained and horrible. I just booked it the fuck out of there. I found a lot of really odd creatures there, things that looked mutated, or animals that shouldn't be in Texas at all. Walking to school with my brother one time, I found what looked like a flattened monkey. It had a very primate face. It unnerved me a lot to look at it. I found out a couple of years later that there was a power plant in that town that often dumped things into the water. It was an island, and I wouldn't be surprised if that caused some mutations. I don't know if they'd get as fucked up as what I saw, though. Moving on from my old home for a moment, I was staying at a friend's grandmother's house for a couple days. It was a pretty old country home, with a barn right out back, also surrounded by woods, miles of woods. Her grandmother was pretty adamant that we stayed out of them, so naturally we decided we should go. We gathered up little bags of supplies, a flashlight, and hopped the barbed wire fence. After about half an hour of walking, we realized we'd been going in circles. I was pretty baffled as to how, because we were following a marked path, but we'd always end up at these 4 man-made ponds. The whole time she was telling me about the woods, how she'd always hear noises from them at night, how sometimes she'd find dead animals, including her grandmother's livestock, laying at the tree line. Now this wouldn't be strange if they weren't all beheaded. We wandered for a while until we ended up at this shabby old ramshackle place, windows smashed in, glass all around, a rusted car sitting wheelless in front. We got this really cold feeling in our stomachs and she was wanting to turn back, but I told her we'd be just fine. We poked around inside. The door just swung open, and immediately I felt something crunch under my foot. I looked down and realized it was a smashed baby doll. There must have been at least 20 of them, in pieces all over the floor. Newspaper clippings on the wall, all dated from the 60s and 70s. About that time, I felt something cold and prickling climb up my spine and started to back out the door, telling her to hurry up. We started to run, feeling more urgent every second, and when we'd nearly left the clearing, I made the mistake of looking back. There, hovering about a foot off the ground, was this woman. She looked wrong, like her pieces were put together wrong, slammed from different dimensions. I can't adequately describe just how awful it was. And then she just screeched. It made my stomach sick, all my hairs stand up, cut right through me, and I was running again before I even knew it. Flew right over the trails, grazed over the fence, cutting up our legs on the barbed wire. All that night we heard knocks along the sides of the house. We had vivid nightmares for the rest of my stay there, and once or twice we saw a silhouette standing in the window. When I asked her about this story later, she pretended not to remember for a couple of years. And at the end of high school, begrudgingly, she told me she did remember but had been trying like hell to forget.
When I was a kid, I lived in central Manitoba, some little backwater town a few hours away from Winnipeg. Anyhow, obviously where I lived there was a lot of wilderness and cool-looking places for a kid like me to explore. So explore I did. There were rumors of a witch that lived in the forest. There was a large pond that divided two forests. The one she supposedly lived in was the one that was further from town. So the story went that if she caught anyone on her land, which was deep in the woods, she'd kill them and store their body parts in a refrigerator in the woods. I really wanted to see it for myself, so I went into the woods during the day and walked for an hour or two along this tiny little path. Somewhere along the way I came across a clearing. It wasn't creepy or anything, but there were lots of crows, and I can't remember hearing anything except for them. I kept going, the continuation of the path being on the other side of the clearing, and eventually the woods grew so dense that it was actually blocking out some sunlight. At that point, I found a typee. It looked old, and no shit, a refrigerator was behind it. I didn't bother looking in either of them because oh no, the witch is real. I left immediately and got home and never went back. Forgot about it for a while. So, a few months ago, my sister and I got to talking about the creepy woods and other stuff in our old town, and I asked her if she remembered the story about the witch in the woods. She stared at me for a moment and then started laughing. It had actually been her and her friends that put up the teepee. They'd made up the story too. It's not really scary, so sorry for that. I just always thought it was funny how their joke had become the terror of kids my age back then. I might have better stories, but I'd have to really think about it. Sorry again. OP's got cooler stories.
I'm usually a lurker, but this thread has caught my interest. I'm not far from OP's area in southwest Louisiana. My dad actually lived in Vider for a year or so, which was mentioned by the OP earlier. Just thought I'd share an odd event that happened about 3 years ago when I lived further out in the woods. It was the day before trash day, and it had always been my responsibility to take the trash cans to the road for the dump truck to empty in the morning. I always dropped them off at the end of our very long driveway, about 1/10 of a mile long, I think, and usually procrastinated so much that I was bringing them out past 9 p.m., sometimes as late as 1 a.m. Our house was a decent distance outside of a town of about 15,000 people. You could walk off my back porch and head for the woods and go through thick forest for a few miles before hitting any civilization at all. Anyway, it's about 11 p.m. on a school night and I still haven't taken the trash out. So my mom starts griping at me and I'm forced to procrastinate no longer. The oddest thing about this whole thing is that nothing before this had been weird. By that I mean it felt like such a normal day. I was doing a normal chore mindlessly. The whole thing leading up to it was just so incredibly typical. We had 3 trash cans, one with wheels and the other 2 were old ones that I had to drag. I usually took the wheeled one with one of the old ones and then came back for the third on my second trip. I set out with my mind on some conversation I was having with someone online and looking up at the stars. It was a clear night and no one was out this late on a school night. Not that there are many people in the area to be out, but the point I'm making is, it was a very peaceful night. I brought the trash cans all the way down the driveway and set them both on the edge of the terrible, barely gravel road that I lived on and turned around back towards the west to start walking down my driveway again. I get 10 or 15 paces away and suddenly I feel this bizarre, otherworldly cold chill going down my spine, as though my body knew that I should be terrified, but my mind hadn't caught on yet. And after 2 or 3 seconds of it, I suddenly got this feeling that I was being watched. I looked up from the driveway. I had been examining the ditches forming where tires had repeatedly dug into the mud, and to the west, ahead of me, where I saw nothing. The feeling persisted for the 2 seconds I spent quickly scanning our backyard's fence line. Then I moved my gaze to the north, my right, where I saw a blue ghostly figure that seemed about 7 feet tall. I noticed immediately that the body itself wasn't solid, as I could see the woods behind it, and I was aware that its head area was less opaque. I instinctively crouched for some reason and watched it, as it seemingly faced me, as the cold chill persisted. It watched for what I guess was about 20 seconds without moving, and I didn't notice any noises. I considered rushing towards it, God knows why, but stayed put mostly out of fear. It seemed like it was floating a few inches above the ground, because when it left, after it drifted back into the woods, I pretty much ran back to my house and went through the garage door to grab the large flashlight that we keep on top of the fridge, and then dashed through the house to the front door and jumped out onto the porch, with my mom behind me wondering what's going on. I pointed the flashlight where I thought the entity had vanished into the woods and started walking to the edge of the porch, breathing hard. Mom followed me out on the porch, asking me what was wrong, but I shushed her and kept watching and listening. After about 15 seconds of silence, except for our breathing, I get the cold chill again, but this time, instead of seeing the entity, a faint rumbling starts in the back of my head. I can't really describe this without sounding insane, but it wasn't an audible sound, more like I could hear it with a sense that wasn't actually what you and I would call hearing at all. The rumbling went on for 20, maybe 30 seconds and never got all that loud, then faded away and the cold chill subsided again. After waiting for another 2 or 3 minutes outside, I went inside and explained to my mother, who would later tell the family that I talked about this with, that she had never seen that kind of terror on my face before, and that don't make these kinds of things up. There are a few other odd events I could talk about from the same area, but none as interesting, and none as unexplainable to me.
Holy shit. All of this is 100% true, by the way. I live in a mostly rural part of Pennsylvania. Within driving distance of me is this little old church kind of out in the middle of nowhere in the woods. On the other side of the road from the church is a big graveyard. According to local legend, it's haunted. There's a big story about events surrounding it, but it's unimportant to this. Anyway, I used to go hang out in the parking lot there at night with friends to look for ghosts and shit. A couple times I've seen and heard things, but the 3 most significant experiences are these. First, there was the time I was sitting in my car, which was parked and turned off. All of a sudden, the back end of the car slammed down as if someone had jumped on it. I believe the second happened the same night, but I can't remember. Anyway, this loud drum sound starts coming from the woods. Not like a band drum, but one of those gigantic, deep drums you have to beat with the huge drumstick thing. Boom, boom. As I'm wondering WTF it is, it starts getting closer. Then it comes up right behind my car, real fast, real loud. My friends start having a downright panic attack, bawling and screaming at me to go because something bad is here. I just about piss myself as I'm turning my car on to take off. As we're leaving, it felt like something was choking me. I was so scared I literally started crying. The third incident involved this shack thing by the church in the back of the parking lot. One night I'm there with like 2 other people, and something starts banging on the shack. We figure it might just be acorns or something falling off the trees, so we start picking up acorns and chucking them at different parts of the shack to compare the noises. It was nothing like it, and the banging noise was much louder, as if someone was whacking it full force with a baseball bat. We eventually got creeped out and left. Another weird thing I remember is this one time I was out hiking around this game land area I like to hang out in. There's a stream you have to cross to get to this boulder field, and in front of the stream is this big patch of mud. I had crossed it and went up to the boulder field for a while and then came back down. Nobody else was up there, but when I came back down, right in the middle of the mud was a small little human footprint, like a 3-year-old size. No other footprints around it. I would have had to stretch my legs or jump to step there, but there it was, a tiny lone footprint. Another experience I had was when I took a friend to this abandoned log cabin out in the middle of this one state park. To get there, you have to either hike or drive down this small little dirt road with a bunch of stones and holes. Anyway, we get up to the cabin and nobody else is there. I go up the side steps to go in the side door. When you go in that door, right to the right and straight up is a staircase that goes to the upper room. Anyway, right as I'm about to step in the door, I hear something walk across the top floor towards the stairs. It was big and sounded like it was on 4 legs, so I noped right out of there. Another time, me and a friend went hiking at night back to this clearing in the woods, and these bluish-green orbs appeared and floated down into the trees towards us. Where they vanished, we heard footsteps walking towards us. As they got to the clearing, they stopped, and it felt like something was touching us all over. Pennsylvania is pretty ridiculous as far as having a lot of creepy shit.
This is a great thread, and I'll help attempt keep it alive with my shit tier stories. I live in North Carolina, pretty much bordering South Carolina and about 15 minutes from the beach. But the part where I live is mostly country, with a bunch of farms and whatnot. The house I live in is on the edge of the woods, with my room being the one facing it. Anyways, my dad and I, back when I was 9 or 10, would occasionally go on walks through our woods just to see if we could find anything interesting. Our woods aren't really deep, just incredibly wide and thick with a few trails in them. One day, we were walking through the woods, and we saw this little burrow-like thing that looked like something possibly a raccoon would live in. We looked in there and were wondering what lived in it when these 2 red eyes opened up. These eyes were a lot bigger than any animals I know of. If I had to guess, they were roughly the size of the bottom of a soda can. We didn't really get scared. We just stared at it for a good 30 seconds and we just kept on with our walk. So, a buddy and I decided to do some walking around in those woods from my last story down by this creek that divides it pretty much as far as you can walk. We were messing around, talking and everything. Nothing seemed weird, but then my friend said he heard rustling in the bushes from across the creek. I just dismiss it as some animal and we go back to our business. A few minutes later, I had this odd feeling I was being watched. So I kept looking around my surroundings, seeing if there was anything out of place. And from the looks of it, my friend was too. We looked across the creek at the thick part of the woods that's uncleared, and we heard these 3 grunts that sounded incredibly deep and ape-like. We booked it the fuck out of there, and when we got back home, we just thought it was our parents or neighbor messing with us. So we go back the next day, seeing if it had happened again. And we notice across the creek this baby tree. Obviously it wasn't huge, but it was thick enough to where I don't think a person could do this. Snapped in half. Now that I think back, it could have possibly been a bear or something, but still it scared the shit out of me. But I'm not so sure because I've never heard a bear do 3 quick loud grunts like we heard. There's this pretty big community full of huge woods that aren't as thick as mine, but the size of them is immense. Anyways, I was staying at a friend's house and we were playing around in his yard at night since you can't go anywhere in the town due to a curfew. We sat down on the ground near his road with his little brother, all of us just talking about school, games, and whatever, when all of a sudden we heard this scream like a scream you'd hear in a horror movie coming from down the road. We looked at each other, obviously sketched out, and so we decided to go back in and call it a night. The next day, my friend, his brother, and I all go to the woods that they usually go to camp with their father, or ride the dirt jumps people made for BMX bikes. They decided they should go to their campground, which is a good 15-20-minute hike through their woods. On the way there, after we'd been going for about 10 minutes, my friend said, "Anon, this place feels different than usual." And I didn't know how to respond to that, considering I've never been to these parts of the woods. I didn't take too much mind of it since his brother didn't say he felt weird or anything. So we kept going. And then we heard the scream we heard the night before coming from the way we just came. We looked at each other, all freaked out and whatnot, and I asked my friend if there was another way out of his woods. He says yeah, and we ditch heading to the campground and head off the trail a bit. We reach the other trail and we hear the screaming again, except closer to us, so we start walking faster, trying to avoid whatever we're hearing. The third scream was the closest sounding, and it gives me chills just remembering it. It sounded as if it was right behind us, so we all started running without hesitation, and we found the other exit, jumped the ditch and ran home the fastest we've ever ran. Sorry for the wall of text, but it was probably my longest story.
I figure since the thread has been up for a few days and successful, I'll add something. 3 stories involving woods. I am originally from South Carolina, but live in Canada now. My family likes to go deer hunting, and I went with them until the age where I needed to pass a safety course, and I never got around to doing it. There is a conservation area that belongs to Clemson University, but a few weeks out of the year it's open to hunters to lower the deer population. My dad and grandpa went one time and split off from each other. A few hours later they meet up, and my grandfather seemed spooked and uneasy. He said he had to take my dad back out to the woods to show him something. My grandfather had said he had seen some big trees swaying back and forth pretty hard and heard a yelling sound. Now apparently these trees were too big for a bear or person to grab and shake like that, and there were no wind or storms that day. Nearby they had found a deep pit with various animal bones like goat, deer, etc. The pit seemed to be about 6 to 7 feet deep. The best explanation they could come up with was that it was a Bigfoot or something similar. The howls, yelling noises sound similar to those you see on those shows on TV about Bigfoot. Another time my dad had gone to the same area and was hunting alone. On his way back to the truck he saw something weird moving in the brush. He found this weird-looking baby ferret type thing. He brought it home and showed it to us. He later contacted the local university to try to determine what type of animal it was. They were unable to identify it, so he brought it home. We feed it milk and whatnot, but it eventually died about a month later. Last story, this time in a different location. We used to drive down to McCormick, South Carolina to do some hunting as well. We had a camper at a local campground and restaurant area that used to belong to a guy named Bill, not sure if still the current owner. Anyway, we'd leave and go to various spots to hunt around the area. There was one popular area we went to that had a long dirt road with a dead end. About a mile or so in on the right, there was an old cemetery that was in the middle of the woods in an opening. No gates or anything, it was dilapidated and ran down tombstones, uneven and sticking out 45 degrees, etc. out of the ground, some broken and smashed. We were allowed to hunt there, and usually we'd sit just outside of the edge of the clearing and wait for deer. Of course, being a 200 to 300-year-old cemetery, it was beyond creepy, and we always felt watched. There would be this thick, heavy mist that would rise about the graves before dawn. The mist never traveled outside of the clearing. One time I went and saw this huge mound of dirt with tons of flowers just tossed on it. I was told to not go near it, as it was somebody who had been buried recently and was too poor to afford a coffin or whatever, and they just dumped the body and covered it up with flowers and dirt. It struck me as odd as to why anyone would bury a body in an abandoned cemetery. I will see if I can find out what the name of that cemetery was. I have forgotten the name of the cemetery, as it has been about 20 years or so. There is another abandoned cemetery in McCormick that has a troll. Badwell Cemetery. In McCormick, South Carolina is a cemetery that is very old, several hundred years. It is the place of burial for French Huguenot settlers. The cemetery is surrounded by old stone blocks, and the gate was iron with the Grim Reaper on the front. There have been numerous sightings of a troll walking the perimeter. The gate is no longer on the entrance due to theft. There have been many strange occurrences at the site by young and old alike.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.